poor trash waiter. My own father spat those words right at my face while my mother smirked beside him. They mocked my job and my life right inside the very restaurant I built from nothing. But the real shock came when a billionaire guest walked into the room, looked around, and asked them what the owner was doing wearing an apron. The silence that followed was absolute perfection. I am Kiara, 33 years old, and I have spent the last 4 years building a culinary and real estate empire, while my family thought I was drowning in failure. I dropped out of corporate law to pursue hospitality, a choice that got me disowned and ridiculed by the very people who were supposed to protect me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to prove your worth to a family that constantly overlooked you. The VIP dining room of the Obsidian Room in Atlanta is my absolute pride and joy. The mahogany tables are polished to a flawless mirror finish. The ambient lighting is perfectly calibrated to cast a warm glow, and the atmosphere screams exclusive black excellence. I usually stay behind the scenes managing my holding company, but tonight my lead server had a sudden family emergency. I never mind putting on a crisp black apron and covering a shift for my staff. It keeps me grounded and connected to the daily rhythm of my business. I was carefully wiping down table 4, making sure the crystal water goblets caught the light perfectly when the heavy oak doors swung open. I froze in place. Walking through the threshold were the last people I ever expected to see in my establishment. My father Carlton, my mother Vivian, my sister Jasmine, and her white husband Connor. I had not seen them in 4 years. Not since the day they packed my bags and kicked me out of their house for refusing to take the bar exam. I kept my head down for a fraction of a second, steadying my breathing and forcing my heart rate to slow. I draped the pristine linen towel over my arm and stood up straight, plastering on the neutral, polite expression I require from all my front-of-house staff. I was ready to treat them like any other high-paying guests. But my father recognized me instantly. Carlton stopped dead in his tracks right in the middle of the dining room. His eyes swept over my uniform, taking in the plain black button-down shirt and the apron tied tightly around my waist. The look of utter disgust that twisted his features was so deeply familiar, it almost made me laugh. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I had been for the past 4 years. He did not ask if I was healthy or happy. He just scoffed a harsh, vibrating sound in the quiet room. "A poor trash waiter," he said, his voice dripping with venom and disappointment. 33 years old, Kiara, and this is what you amount to. I always knew you were destined for the bottom. My mother Vivian stepped out from behind him, aggressively adjusting a heavy diamond necklace that I knew for a fact my father was still paying off. She was wearing a completely inappropriate amount of jewelry for a Tuesday evening dinner, desperate to project wealth. She looked me up and down like I was a stain she had scraped off the bottom of her designer shoe. "I told you, Carlton," she chimed in, her tone laced with that sickening satisfaction she always got from my supposed failures. When she dropped out of corporate law to play with pots and pans, I knew she would end up fetching water for people like us. We gave her every opportunity to be a respectable attorney, and she chose to be a servant. Just pathetic. Her words hung in the air, designed to cut me down to size. They had always been obsessed with status. Growing up, our house was a performance stage where we had to constantly prove our worth to the black upper-class elite of Atlanta. Carlton ran a logistics firm and believed that having a lawyer daughter was his ticket to universal respect at the country club. When I chose culinary arts and business management instead, they viewed it as a personal attack on their social standing. They could not brag about a daughter working in a kitchen, so they threw me away. A hot spark of anger flared in my chest, but I quickly extinguished it. I knew exactly what they wanted. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to shrink to cry, to run out of the room in shame, so they could feel superior and validated in their terrible parenting. I absolutely refused to give them the satisfaction. I remained perfectly composed. I picked up the heavy silver water pitcher from the serving station and moved gracefully around the table, pouring ice water into their crystal glasses with practiced precision. I did not spill a single drop. I did not break eye contact when I moved past my sister Jasmine. Jasmine had always been the golden child, the one who followed their rules perfectly, the one who never stepped out of line, and the one who eagerly absorbed all their financial support. She was wearing a cocktail dress that looked suspiciously like a cheap knockoff, her arms crossed tight over her chest as she stared at me with pure disdain. She was looking at me exactly the way our parents had taught her to, like I was entirely beneath her, a cautionary tale of what happens when you disobey the family patriarch. She did not say a word to me, just let out a quiet, condescending sigh as I filled her glass. I stepped back and clasped my hands behind my back, maintaining the posture of a consummate professional. I knew Carlton's logistics firm had been struggling heavily. The rumors in the Atlanta commercial real estate circles were incredibly loud. He was desperate to maintain his image, attending all the charity galas, while quietly defaulting on corporate loans. Seeing him here posturing and puffing his chest out while wearing a suit that was clearly 5 years out of style was deeply telling. But I felt absolutely no pity for him. I remembered the cold nights I slept in my car after they disowned me. I remembered the grueling hours working 3 different kitchen jobs to save enough capital to open my first tiny cafe. I remembered the relentless grind, the burn scars on my forearms, the rejection from banks who did not want to fund a young black woman without a corporate cosigner. I had built a massive holding company and a hospitality empire through sheer blood and sweat, and they were standing in the crown jewel of that empire calling me trash. Connor, Jasmine's husband, finally decided to make his presence known. He settled heavily into the plush leather chair, shooting his cuffs to reveal a flashy, oversized watch that screamed of financial insecurity. Connor had always rubbed me the wrong way. He came from a family with old money that had long since dried up, but he still carried a staggering amount of unearned arrogance. He married Jasmine because she fed his fragile ego, and my parents loved him because his presence somehow validated their proximity to white corporate wealth. He leaned back in his chair, looked directly at my face, and snapped his fingers at me. The sharp cracking sound echoed loudly in the private dining room, a blatant display of disrespect meant to put me in my place. "Hey," Connor smirked, his tone dripping with thick condescension. "Bring us the reserve wine list, and try not to spill anything on my tailored suit, sweetheart." I looked at Connor's snapping fingers, noting the slight fraying at the edge of his shirt cuff. It was a subtle detail, but one that spoke volumes to someone trained to observe everything. The tailored suit he was so incredibly proud of looked like it had seen better days, carrying a faint sheen that suggested it had been dry cleaned far too many times. I maintained my neutral expression, refusing to let his microaggression crack my professional armor. My parents watched the exchange with eager anticipation, waiting for me to break. My mother actually leaned forward, her eyes bright with a predatory gleam, hoping to witness my complete humiliation right here in the middle of a high-end restaurant. This was exactly the kind of toxic dynamic I had escaped 4 years ago. Our family dinners used to be battlegrounds where my worth was constantly measured against Jasmine's compliance and Connor's supposed pedigree. Every holiday, every Thanksgiving, every Sunday dinner was an opportunity for Carlton to remind me that my passion for the culinary arts was a waste of my intellect. They believed that success could only be measured in billable hours and corner offices at downtown law firms. They could not fathom the discipline, the strategic networking, and the sheer financial acumen required to build a multi-million-dollar hospitality group from scratch. To them, serving food was the ultimate degradation, a return to a subservience they had spent their entire lives trying to outrun. They had no idea that the very ground they were standing on, the custom-imported hardwood floors of the Obsidian Room, belonged entirely to me. They had no idea that the expensive abstract art hanging on the walls was from my personal collection, or that the bespoke menu they were about to order from was crafted by a James Beard-nominated chef I had personally recruited and funded. They only saw what they wanted to see, a daughter who had failed to meet their rigid, suffocating standards, now reduced to taking their drink orders. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch out for just a second too long, making the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. I knew how to play this game better than they ever could. I was no longer the vulnerable 29-year-old girl begging for her father's approval and her mother's warmth. I was a seasoned executive, a woman who routinely negotiated seven-figure commercial real estate deals before lunch. Dealing with a fading patriarch, a bitter matriarch, a spoiled sister, and an arrogant brother-in-law was nothing compared to the challenges I conquered every single day. I looked Connor directly in his eyes, offering a smile so flawlessly polite, it was essentially a weapon. I nodded once, acknowledging his demand without offering a single word of submission, setting the stage for the absolute destruction of their fragile egos. I placed the heavy leather-bound reserve wine list directly in front of Connor. He did not bother to look up at my face. Instead, he flipped through the thick parchment pages with a loud, theatrical sigh, making a deliberate show of being thoroughly underwhelmed. He stopped at the Bordeaux section and tapped his manicured index finger against a particularly expensive listing. He leaned back in his chair, draped his arm around my sister Jasmine, and looked at me with a smirk that practically begged for a physical reaction. "Tell me about this one," he commanded, his tone dripping with thick condescension. "Read the description out loud for us. Let us see if they actually train the help here, or if they just pull you off the street in a desperate attempt to staff the floor. Take your time, sweetheart. You can sound it out if the French words are too difficult for you." Jasmine giggled a high-pitched grating sound that immediately transported me back to our childhood. She pressed her cheek against his tailored shoulder, looking at me like I was a museum exhibit of utter failure. "You know she never did well with foreign languages, Connor," she said, her voice laced with mock sympathy. "Do not embarrass her too much. She is just trying to earn an honest hourly wage." I did not need to look at the menu. I knew every single detail printed on that page. I had personally curated every bottle resting in the climate-controlled cellar beneath our feet, flying directly to the vineyards in France to negotiate the allocations. I kept my posture perfectly straight, and my hands clasped professionally behind my back. I looked directly into his pale eyes. "That is the Chateau Haut-Brion, 2009. I replied, my pronunciation flawless, and rolling off my tongue with absolute ease. "It is a Premier Grand Cru class from Pessac-Léognan. A masterful blend of 46% Merlot, 40% Cabernet Sauvignon, and 14% Cabernet Franc. You will find it offers an extraordinary bouquet of crushed rocks, black plum-roasted espresso beans, and a subtle hint of burning embers. It is aged in custom French oak barrels, making it incredibly full-bodied, with a dense velvety tannin structure that finishes with remarkable length and purity. It pairs exceptionally well with the dry-aged Wagyu ribeye you were eyeing earlier, assuming your palate can handle the complexity." Connor's smug smile vanished instantly. For a split second, he looked exactly like a deer caught in headlights, completely stripped of his racist assumption that a black woman in a service apron lacked the education to outclass him. He blinked rapidly, opening his mouth to speak, but finding absolutely nothing clever or demeaning to say. He looked down at the menu, attempting to verify my words, but his silence was the absolute sweetest sound in the entire room. I watched his fragile ego shatter and attempt to rebuild itself in real time, right in front of his wife. My mother Vivian could not stand the sudden shift in power. She practically vibrated with defensive energy, desperate to protect the white son-in-law she viewed as a status symbol. She aggressively smoothed the linen napkin on her lap and glared at me. Her eyes narrowed into familiar slits of disapproval. "Well, anyone can memorize a script to get better tips," she said, her voice sharp and dripping with undeniable malice. Connor actually appreciates fine wine. He comes from a family with a real legacy of collecting. He has a highly refined palate. It is a good thing you are memorizing these little details, Kiara. At least you are learning something valuable from serving your betters. It is just a massive shame you use your intellect to peddle expensive alcohol and fetch hot plates instead of doing something respectable with your life." She leaned forward, pointing a perfectly manicured acrylic nail at my chest. "You had a full ride to law school. You had a clear path to a corner office and a chance to make this family proud in Atlanta high society. Instead, you threw it all away to sweat in a hot kitchen and wait on people hand and foot. Look at your sister Jasmine. She married a man of substance. She lives in a gated community in Buckhead. She upheld the strict standard of this family. And here you are wearing a cheap uniform hoping we leave you a 20% gratuity. It is humiliating for us to even be seen with you. The irony of her statement was staggering. Jasmine lived in a gated community simply because my father paid her mortgage every single month. Connor was a man of substance only if you considered massive credit card debt and a string of failed startup ventures to be substantial. I knew exactly how heavily leveraged they were because my financial advisors moved in the same elite circles they desperately pretended to belong to. Connor was drowning in debt, and Jasmine was too busy shopping to notice the collection notices. But I kept my face utterly blank. I simply offered a polite professional nod, acknowledging my mother's insult, as if she had just asked for an extra set of silverware. I watched Vivian reach for her water glass, her hand trembling slightly under the weight of her own manufactured outrage. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of Black excellence defined entirely by country club memberships, luxury cars, and zip codes. To her, a daughter in the hospitality industry was a stain on that pristine facade. She could not comprehend that the very industry she looked down upon was generating more revenue in a single weekend than Carlton's logistics firm generated in an entire financial quarter. She assumed I was living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to pay rent in some rundown apartment. She had no idea that I resided in a custom-built penthouse just 10 blocks away, funded entirely by the profits of the restaurant she was currently sitting in. Jasmine chimed in again, eager to twist the knife further. Mommy is right, Kiara. You really should consider going back to school. Connor's firm might need a receptionist next year if you want a desk job. We could probably put in a good word for you so you do not have to stand on your feet all night. Connor puffed out his chest at the suggestion, nodding solemnly as if he actually possessed a functioning firm that was not currently facing bankruptcy proceedings. I could have destroyed them right then and there. I could have listed the exact dollar amount of the liens placed against Connor's business. I could have exposed the reality of their fragile financial house of cards. But patience is the most crucial ingredient in both fine dining and sweet revenge. I chose to let them continue digging their own graves. My complete lack of emotional reaction infuriated my father. Carlton had been relatively quiet until now, but his anxiety was practically rolling off him in heavy waves. He adjusted his silk tie, violently shifting his weight in the heavy dining chair. His logistics company was bleeding capital, and tonight was his final desperate attempt to secure a lifeline from a major investor. He pulled back his suit sleeve, checking his gold Rolex watch for the third time in 2 minutes. That watch was a relic from a time when his company was actually turning a profit. Now it was just another prop in his exhausting theatrical display of fake wealth and hollow prestige. He slammed his hand flat against the table, making the fine crystal glassware rattle dangerously. "Wipe that defiant look off your face right now," he ordered, his voice low and threatening, a tone he used to terrify me when I was a child. "I know exactly what you are doing. You are standing there judging us, acting like you are completely above the consequences of your own terrible life choices. You think you can stand there and patronize my son-in-law with your memorized little wine facts. I will not tolerate this insolence from a failure. Not tonight." He pointed a shaking finger toward the heavy oak doors of the VIP room, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and sheer panic. "Fetch your manager immediately. I am hosting a billionaire investor tonight. A man who holds the absolute power to save my company and elevate this family to the next level of wealth. I absolutely refuse to let a poor trash waiter ruin this evening with a bad attitude. I will have you fired and thrown out the back door before he even walks in. I refuse to let you embarrass me." I gave my father a single crisp nod. I offered no argument and no defense. I simply presented the perfect picture of an obedient server yielding to an irate guest. I pivoted on my heel and walked out of the private dining room. The heavy oak doors closed silently behind me, shutting off the toxic sound of my family shifting in their leather chairs. The moment I stepped into the bustling corridor, my professional facade melted into cold calculation. I walked past the open kitchen where my executive chef was orchestrating the evening service with flawless precision. The smell of seared wagyu and toasted spices filled the air, a stark contrast to the bitter stench of desperation radiating from the room I had just left. I found Elias standing near the main host podium. Elias was my general manager and my most trusted confidant. I had poached him from a highly acclaimed restaurant group in New York 3 years ago, paying him double his previous salary because he shared my exact vision for absolute perfection. He also knew my entire family history. He knew the reason my private security team had a strict protocol regarding anyone carrying my maiden name. I stepped up beside him and gave him the situation in 3 rapid sentences. Elias did not flinch. A sharp glint of amusement flashed in his dark eyes as he adjusted the lapels of his custom suit. He understood the assignment instantly. We walked back down the corridor side by side. I pushed open the heavy doors to the VIP room and stepped aside to let him enter first. Carlton was already standing. He had unbuttoned his suit jacket and was pacing a short line near the head of the table, practicing the aggressive posture he always used to intimidate subordinates. When he saw Elias walk in, his chest puffed out further. He pointed a rigid finger directly at my face. "Are you the manager of this establishment?" Carlton demanded, his voice booming off the acoustic paneling. "Because if you are, you need to explain to me why this woman is allowed to interact with high-paying clientele. She is completely inept, disrespectful, and frankly, her presence here is a massive liability to your reputation. I demand that you strip her of that apron immediately and throw her out the back door. I want her off the premises before my guest arrives." Vivian nodded emphatically from her seat, picking up her silver fork and pointing it toward Elias. "My husband is absolutely right," she chimed in. "We are hosting a highly influential venture capitalist tonight, a man who expects nothing but the highest standard of service. We cannot have a disgruntled dropout ruining the atmosphere with her blue-collar attitude. You need to fire her right now. It is for the good of your own business." I stood silently near the doorway, keeping my hands folded behind my back. I caught Elias catching my eye for a fraction of a second. I gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of my head. "Do not give them an inch." Elias turned his attention back to my father. He clasped his hands in front of him, radiating the calm, authoritative energy that made him such an exceptional manager. "Sir, I deeply apologize if your server has done anything to disrupt your dining experience tonight," Elias said, his tone smooth and perfectly professional. "However, I am afraid fulfilling your request to terminate her employment is completely impossible." Carlton stopped pacing. The vein in his neck visibly throbbed. "Impossible," he spat out the word like it tasted foul. "Do you know who I am? I run one of the largest logistics firms in this city. I spend thousands of dollars entertaining clients at places like this. I am telling you to fire a single waiter." "I understand your frustration, sir." Elias continued, his voice never rising or wavering. "But we are currently operating under severe staffing shortages this evening. 2 of our senior servers called out with medical emergencies just hours before service began. Furthermore, we are strictly bound by union regulations and labor laws regarding immediate termination without documented cause. Removing her from the floor tonight would critically compromise our service standards for the entire restaurant. She is absolutely essential to our operations this evening." The word essential seemed to strike my family like a physical blow. They had spent my entire life treating me like an expendable asset, a prop they could discard the moment I stopped fitting their rigid narrative. Hearing a respected manager in a high-end establishment refer to me as indispensable completely short-circuited their reality. Connor let out a loud, arrogant scoff, throwing his hands up in the air. "This is unbelievable," Connor sneered, shaking his head. "You people are protecting a bad employee because of some ridiculous staffing excuse. Do you realize the kind of online review I could leave for this place? I know people in the local food media. I could have the health inspector auditing your kitchen by tomorrow morning. You do not want to test me, pal." Elias offered a polite but deeply unimpressed smile. "You are entirely within your rights to share your feedback, sir, but my staffing decisions remain final. Now, if you will excuse me, I must return to the main floor. I trust Kiara will continue to provide you with attentive service." Elias gave a brief, respectful bow and exited the room, leaving the heavy doors to click shut behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Carlton slowly sat back down in his chair, his face a mask of furious disbelief. He was a patriarch who built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute control, and a restaurant manager had just politely told him he had zero power here. Vivian clutched her pearl necklace, staring at me, as if my continued presence in the room was a personal insult to her existence. But it was Jasmine who truly unraveled. My older sister could not process the fact that she was not getting her way. Her entire worldview relied heavily on me being positioned at the absolute bottom of the food chain. If I could not be fired on command, if I could not be humiliated and thrown out into the street upon their request, then her own sense of superiority was threatened. I watched her perfectly contoured face contort into an ugly mask of bitter frustration. She breathed heavily, her chest rising and falling as she glared at me standing quietly near the wall. She hated my composure. She hated that I was not crying or begging or apologizing for my existence. She needed to break me to restore the natural order of our family dynamic. Jasmine slowly reached out and wrapped her manicured fingers around the stem of her heavy crystal water goblet. The glass was filled to the brim with iced, sparkling water condensation gathering on the sides. She picked it up, maintaining dead eye contact with me. She did not say a word. She simply moved her arm outward, holding the heavy glass directly over the edge of the table. My father saw what she was doing and did not intervene. My mother simply adjusted her posture, ready to watch the show. Connor leaned back, grinning with anticipation. Jasmine released her grip. The heavy crystal goblet plummeted in slow motion. The crash was deafening in the quiet acoustic space of the VIP room. Shards of thick, jagged glass exploded across the imported custom hardwood floors that I had personally selected and paid for. Ice cubes scattered like diamonds, and the sparkling water pooled heavily, seeping toward the expensive baseboards. I did not flinch at the sound. I just looked at the mess and then back up at my sister. Jasmine leaned over the armrest of her leather dining chair. She rested her chin delicately on her hand, flashing a saccharine, venomous smile that was meant to shatter my dignity. "Oops," she said, the word dripping with malicious joy. "Looks like your essential waiter has a mess to clean. Get on your knees, Kiara." I stared down at the shattered crystal and the pooling water spreading across the polished hardwood. Jasmine wore a smile of pure, triumphant malice, expecting me to drop to the floor and ruin my uniform in a desperate scramble to clean up her engineered mess. She wanted me on my hands and knees, submitting to her fabricated hierarchy. I did not blink, and I certainly did not kneel. I turned on my heel and walked calmly to the discreet service station tucked behind a mahogany partition. I retrieved a sleek, long-handled dustpan and a fine, bristled broom designed specifically for maintaining the dining room, without ever requiring a staff member to stoop. When I returned to the table, Jasmine let out a sharp breath of irritation. Her grand vision of my humiliation evaporated as I stood perfectly upright, sweeping the glittering shards with effortless mechanical precision. I did not look at her. I simply let the rhythmic sound of the broom against the floor fill the tense silence of the room. Because I was wearing an apron, my family immediately relegated me to the status of furniture. To them, a server was essentially invisible, a low-class worker completely incapable of comprehending the complexities of their elite world. They dropped their guard instantly, assuming my brain was only equipped to process food orders and bus tables. I kept my eyes focused on the broken glass, but my ears caught every single word of the venomous argument that erupted the moment they thought they were safe to speak freely. Carlton leaned across the table, his previous bravado collapsing into raw panic. He pointed a rigid finger directly at Connor's chest. "You promised me that the Midtown commercial lease was an ironclad guarantee," Carlton hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You leveraged my logistics firm as collateral for a dead-end commercial zone, Connor. The creditors called my private line this morning. We are in technical default on our financial covenants. You assured me the bridge loan would cover our operational costs until the fourth quarter." Connor aggressively adjusted his fraying collar, his face flushing a deep, angry red. It was a strategic market shift. Carlton Connor shot back defensive and sweating. The zoning board delayed the permits. It is a temporary liquidity issue, not a complete failure. We just need a heavy injection of capital to bridge the gap and stabilize the portfolio. Once we get the funding, everything balances out. I continued sweeping, gathering the final fragments of crystal into the dustpan. My face remained an impassive mask, but internally my mind was racing with razor-sharp clarity. I knew exactly what Midtown commercial lease they were arguing about. I knew because my holding company had purchased the debt on that exact property 2 weeks ago. Connor had bet his father-in-law's entire company on a development project that was dead on arrival, and he had lost spectacularly. He was trying to mask a catastrophic bankruptcy, with fancy corporate jargon, fully believing the girl in the apron standing 2 feet away had no idea what a financial covenant even was. Jasmine slammed her hand on the table, completely oblivious to the actual gravity of the corporate collapse. "Well, you need to figure out your liquidity issue right now, Connor," she whined, her voice pitching upward in a spoiled tantrum. "My primary credit card was declined at Neiman Marcus yesterday afternoon. The cashier looked at me like I was a criminal. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to have your card rejected in front of the entire country club circuit? I had to leave 3 pairs of designer shoes at the register." Vivian gasped loudly, gripping her diamond necklace as if someone was actively trying to rip it from her throat. She leaned across the table, her eyes wide with absolute terror. "Keep your voices down," Vivian commanded in a frantic, harsh whisper. "If Mr. Sterling walks through those doors and hears even a whisper of insolvency, he will pull out before the appetizers arrive. His venture capital is the only thing standing between us and total ruin." Vivian looked frantically around the room, making sure the doors were still closed before continuing her panicked tirade. "If we do not secure his funding tonight, the bank is seizing the Buckhead estate by the end of the month," she hissed, her voice cracking. "Do you hear me? The estate, everything we have built, the social standing, the memberships, the legacy, all of it will be gone. We will be bankrupt, and the entire city of Atlanta will know we are penniless. You have to sell this pitch to Sterling today, Carlton. Our survival depends entirely on his money." The sheer magnitude of their desperation hung heavy in the air. They were completely broke. The grand facade of black excellence they paraded around Atlanta was nothing but a fragile house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind to knock it down. They were staking their entire future on impressing Mr. Sterling, a billionaire venture capitalist known for his ruthless business acumen. They were treating this dinner as a life-or-death audition. What none of them realized was that Mr. Sterling was not just a guest at my restaurant. He was my personal mentor, my frequent co-investor, and one of my closest business allies. I had reviewed his portfolio investments just last week. I knew for a fact he hated investing in logistics firms. He was only taking this dinner meeting as a polite favor to a mutual acquaintance. My family was banking their entire existence on a man who had zero intention of giving them a single dime. Connor, feeling completely emasculated by Carlton's scolding and his wife's complaints about declined credit cards, desperately needed to reassert his dominance. He needed to prove to his wealthy black in-laws that he was still the successful white businessman they had so eagerly welcomed into their family. He needed to project power, and he chose to use me as his prop to do it. I finished sweeping the glass and stood up, holding the dustpan quietly at my side. Connor locked eyes with me, his jaw set in a hard, arrogant line. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a heavy metal credit card. He tossed it onto the polished mahogany table with a loud, dramatic clack, meant to command the attention of everyone in the room. "Enough stressing about temporary cash flow," Connor declared, puffing his chest out and offering a smug smile to his wife. "We are looking at a minor setback, not a disaster. Bring us the Chateau Haute Brion, the $5,000 bottle we discussed earlier. I am paying for the entire evening tonight to celebrate our upcoming deal with Sterling. We are going to be just fine." Jasmine instantly perked up, reaching over to stroke Connor's arm. her faith in his fabricated wealth entirely restored by the sight of the heavy metal card. Vivian let out a long breath of relief, her shoulders dropping as she bought into the illusion of financial security. Carlton gave a stiff, approving nod, willing to accept Connor's arrogant display if it meant projecting strength before the investor arrived. I looked down at the metal credit card resting on the table. It was supposed to be a symbol of elite status, but I could see the tiny scratches along the edges indicating a card that had been heavily used. I did not say a word. I reached into the deep pocket of my black apron and pulled out my sleek handheld point-of-sale terminal. I picked up Connor's card, holding it carefully by the edges. I tapped the screen on my terminal, pulling up an open tab for their table. I manually entered the custom charge for the $5,000 bottle of wine. I looked right at Connor, maintaining dead eye contact, as I inserted the metal chip into the bottom of the device. The machine hummed quietly as it attempted to process the transaction. Connor kept his smug smile firmly in place, leaning back in his chair like a king surveying his conquered land. He waited for the approving chime that would validate his entire existence in front of his in-laws. Instead, the terminal let out a sharp, aggressive double beep. The digital screen instantly flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red. The word declined stretched across the display in bold block letters. I held the sleek point-of-sale terminal up so the bright red screen illuminated the space between us. The sharp, double beep echoed in the quiet, private dining room. I looked directly into Connor's pale eyes and let a slow, icy smile touch my lips. Declined. Shall we try another card, Connor, or is the suit rented too? The color drained from his face so fast it was almost comical. The smug, arrogant expression he had worn since walking into my restaurant completely evaporated, leaving behind a blotchy, sweating mask of pure panic. He stared at the red screen as if the machine had physically assaulted him. He reached into his pocket and frantically pulled out his phone, his hands shaking violently as he tried to open his banking app. There must be a fraud alert, he stammered, his voice pitching an octave higher than normal. I travel a lot. They probably flagged the transaction because of the amount. It is a security measure. I just need to call my wealth manager and clear the hold. He was lying, and everyone in the room knew it. The heavy metal card sitting in my terminal was not flagged for fraud, it was simply maxed out to the absolute limit. Jasmine practically launched herself out of her leather chair. She pointed her acrylic nail right at my face, her eyes wide with frantic denial. "You did this on purpose," she shrieked. "You pressed the wrong button or canceled the transaction just to humiliate us. You have always been so insanely jealous of my life and my husband. You cannot stand that I married a successful man while you are trapped serving food for minimum wage. Fix the machine right now, Kiara, before I have you arrested for harassment." I did not flinch at her outburst. I simply pressed the print button on the terminal and pulled the small slip of paper that clearly displayed the insufficient funds error code. I placed it gently on the mahogany table, right next to Connor's empty water glass. "The machine operates perfectly, Jasmine," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "The issuing bank simply refuses to extend any more credit to your husband. I suggest you ask him why." Vivian let out a strangled gasp, clutching her diamond necklace as she looked frantically toward the heavy oak doors. "Carlton, do something," she hissed, her voice trembling with absolute terror. "Mr. Sterling could walk through those doors at any second. If he sees us arguing with a waiter over a declined credit card, he will walk right back out. Pay the bill, Carlton. Just pay the bill and get this trash out of our sight." Carlton was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling as he glared daggers at his son-in-law. The illusion of white corporate wealth that Connor had used to secure his place in my status-obsessed family was cracking wide open. Carlton ripped his leather wallet from his inner suit pocket and pulled out his own black corporate card. He slammed it onto the table, sliding it violently toward me. "Process this," he ordered, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "And you, Connor, we will discuss this embarrassing little security hold the moment we get home. You assured me your accounts were liquid." I picked up my father's corporate card and slid it into the chip reader. As the machine hummed processing the $5,000 charge, I leaned in slightly. I kept my voice low, calm, and strictly conversational, ensuring every single word sliced through the tension like a scalpel. "Funny, a declined card," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Connor, whose face was now completely ashen. Especially since public records are so easily accessible these days. They show that your holding company, Apex Solutions, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the Northern District of Georgia last Tuesday. The silence that hit the room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that preempts a massive explosion. I watched my father freeze, his hand still resting on the polished table. Vivian stopped breathing. Jasmine turned her head slowly to look at her husband, her perfectly contoured face twisting in confusion. I printed Carlton's receipt and laid it in front of him, placing a silver pen neatly on top. I continued, my voice steady and relentless. "Did you forget to tell your father-in-law that you blew his investment money, Connor? Did you forget to mention that the $500,000 he gave you to secure that Midtown commercial development is completely gone?" Carlton stood up so fast his heavy leather dining chair screeched backward against the hardwood floor. His eyes were wide with a terrifying mixture of betrayal and financial ruin. My father had leveraged his own failing logistics firm to fund Connor's real estate venture fully, believing that his white son-in-law possessed some innate business genius. He had bet the entire family estate on Connor's fabricated success. "What is she talking about, Connor?" Carlton demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous guttural growl. "Tell me this bitter dropout is lying. Tell me my money is safely sitting in the escrow account like you promised me yesterday morning." Connor pressed his back against his chair, sweating profusely. "Carlton, it is a strategic restructuring," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively. The market shifted. The zoning board delayed the permits, and the creditors panicked. I had to file for Chapter 11 to protect the remaining assets. It is just a temporary legal shield. We will recover the principal investment once the liquidation clears. "You lost my money," Carlton roared, completely abandoning his polished upper-class facade. He reached across the expensive mahogany table and grabbed Connor by the lapels of his tailored suit, hauling him halfway out of his seat. "You arrogant, parasitic fraud. I leveraged my company for you. I put my home on the line for you." Jasmine began to scream, grabbing her father's arm, trying to pull him off her husband. "Dad, stop it! You are ruining his jacket!" she cried out completely, failing to grasp the reality that she was now legally married to a bankrupt criminal. Vivian jumped up, rushing around the table, waving her hands frantically. Carlton let him go. She pleaded, her voice shrill with panic. "You cannot do this here. Mr. Sterling is coming. The investor is coming. If he sees this, we lose everything. We lose the house, Carlton." I stood 2 feet away, watching the entire family tear each other to pieces. The golden child was married to a fraud. The status-obsessed patriarch was financially ruined by his own blind prejudice. The materialistic mother was watching her country club legacy go up in flames. They had walked into my restaurant 10 minutes ago calling me poor trash, and now they were physically fighting over a catastrophic bankruptcy. Carlton shook Connor violently before throwing him back down into the leather chair. Connor gasped for air, pulling at his collar, his face flushed with deep humiliation. Carlton pointed a trembling finger at his son-in-law. "If Sterling does not sign the venture capital agreement tonight, I am going to have you prosecuted for fraud, Connor. I will see you in a federal prison." Before Connor could offer another pathetic excuse, the heavy brass handles of the VIP room doors turned. The loud argument was instantly silenced. Carlton whipped around, smoothing his tie and forcing a desperate, terrifyingly fake smile onto his face. Vivian rushed back to her seat, sitting up perfectly straight and adjusting her jewelry. Jasmine quickly wiped away a stray tear, pretending to examine the fine crystal on the table. They transformed from a violently imploding family into a picture of serene black excellence in less than 2 seconds. The heavy oak doors swung open wide. Mr. Sterling, a towering figure in the venture capital world, and a man whose net worth exceeded $1 billion, walked into the room. He wore a sharp, bespoke suit and carried an aura of absolute, undeniable authority. The heavy oak doors swung completely open, and the transformation that occurred within my family was nothing short of a psychological masterclass in deception. The moment those brass handles clicked, Carlton released Connor's lapels as if the fabric had suddenly caught fire. He took a rapid step back, violently smoothing his own silk tie and aggressively adjusting his cuffs. The terrifying vein, bulging rage that had contorted his face just a second prior vanished entirely. In its place, he plastered on a smile so desperately wide, so incredibly fake, that it looked physically painful. Vivian was equally swift in her deceit. She snapped her spine straight against the back of her leather chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap. She arranged her features into the serene, welcoming mask of a supportive and wealthy matriarch, completely ignoring the fact that she was currently married to a man on the brink of total financial ruin. Jasmine blinked away her angry tears, forcing a bright, vacant smile while frantically fixing her posture. Connor, still gasping slightly for air, desperately tried to smooth the deep, humiliating wrinkles out of his now ruined suit, trying to look like a competent executive rather than a bankrupt fraud who had just been manhandled by his father-in-law. They went from a viciously imploding family to a picture-perfect magazine cover of affluent success in less than 2 seconds. It was sickening. But it was also exactly how they had survived their entire lives, masking their deep dysfunction with high-end brands and country club smiles. Mr. Sterling stepped over the threshold. He was a towering figure in the venture capital world, a man whose net worth exceeded $1 billion, and he carried an aura of absolute, undeniable authority. He wore a sharp, bespoke charcoal suit that did not need to shout to demand attention. He possessed the kind of quiet, steady power that made men like my father, men who were faking their wealth, sweat completely through their expensive shirts. Carlton practically sprinted across the private dining room. He threw his hand out eagerly, crossing the distance with a frantic energy that stripped him of any remaining dignity. "Mr. Sterling." "What an absolute honor," Carlton practically shouted, his voice overly enthusiastic and dripping with pure desperation. "I am Carlton Brown. Welcome. We are so incredibly thrilled you could join us this evening." Carlton did not even wait for Sterling to respond before he launched into his sweaty, meticulously rehearsed pitch. He was terrified of losing the investor's attention for even a fraction of a second. He started talking about his logistics firm, throwing out corporate buzzwords like scalable infrastructure, synergistic growth, and legacy enterprise. He spoke far too fast, his pitch rising in desperation as he tried to secure the single lifeline that would save his Buckhead estate and his precious social standing. He gestured grandly toward the dining table, attempting to position his family as a dynasty of generational success. "This is my family." Carlton continued, his fake smile never wavering. "My beautiful wife Vivian, my daughter Jasmine, and my son-in-law Connor, who handles our major real estate acquisitions. We are a family built on traditional values and corporate excellence." I stood quietly near the service station, my hands clasped professionally behind my back, watching my father diminish himself. 10 minutes ago, he was a ruthless dictator, barking orders at me, threatening to throw me out into the street. He had looked at me with absolute disgust, calling me poor trash. Now he was practically begging, performing a pathetic song and dance for a man he viewed as his financial savior. The hypocrisy was staggering. He was openly bragging about Connor handling real estate acquisitions mere minutes after threatening to send Connor to federal prison for losing $500,000 on a botched deal. Mr. Sterling stopped in his tracks. He did not take my father's outstretched hand. He did not offer a polite greeting to Vivian or Jasmine. He barely even acknowledged Carlton's frantic, rambling pitch. Sterling offered a brief dismissive nod that completely shut down my father's nervous energy. Sterling's sharp eyes scanned the opulent dining room. He was a man who noticed everything. He looked right past the fake smiles plastered on my family's faces. He looked past the remaining shards of shattered crystal swept neatly into the corner. He looked past the extravagant spread of imported delicacies resting on the polished mahogany table. He was looking for someone specific, and he knew exactly who it was. His eyes locked onto me. I was standing perfectly still, holding the point of sale terminal, wearing my crisp black apron over my plain button-down shirt. I maintained my perfectly neutral professional posture, but a genuine spark of warmth ignited in my chest. The stern, unyielding expression on Mr. Sterling's face completely vanished. A bright, genuine smile broke across his features, transforming his entire demeanor. He completely ignored Carlton, stepping right past my father as if he were nothing more than a piece of background furniture. Carlton was left standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, his hand still suspended in the air, his mouth hanging open mid-pitch. The confusion that washed over his face was profound. He could not comprehend why the billionaire investor was walking away from him to approach the hired help. Vivian's perfectly curated smile froze on her face. Her hand dropped from her diamond necklace, hovering in midair. Jasmine shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting wildly between Sterling and me, trying to process the scene unfolding before her. Connor looked like he was about to pass out, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. He knew Mr. Sterling was a titan in the commercial real estate sector. Connor had just bankrupted his own LLC in that exact sector. The panic radiating from him was palpable. Sterling walked straight across the expensive hardwood floor, closing the distance between us with purposeful strides. He did not address me as a subordinate. He did not treat me like a server. He opened his arms wide and pulled me into a warm, familiar, and deeply paternal embrace. I hugged him back, letting a real smile touch my lips for the first time that entire evening. The absolute shock radiating from the dining table behind us was a physical force. The silence in the room was deafening. My family was paralyzed, completely unable to process the visual evidence before them. They had spent my entire life measuring my worth against their shallow social metrics. They had discarded me when I chose a path they deemed unworthy. Now they were watching a man they worshipped, a man they desperately needed, treat me with a level of respect they had never once offered me. To them, I was a lowly server who could barely afford to breathe the same air as their distinguished guest. To Sterling, I was a trusted colleague, a brilliant business mind, and a close friend. I had co-invested with his firm on 3 major commercial development projects over the past 2 years. We had spent countless hours analyzing market trends over black coffee in his private downtown office. He respected my relentless work ethic and my financial acumen. He knew the struggles I had faced to build my hospitality empire from the ground up, and he admired the empire I had successfully constructed. Sterling stepped back, holding me gently by the shoulders. He beamed at me, his eyes crinkling with genuine affection and unhidden amusement. He noticed the apron and the terminal in my hand, but he did not see a failure. He saw a leader willing to get her hands dirty for her business. He did not lower his voice. He delivered his next words loudly and clearly, ensuring that every single syllable reached the ears of the people sitting frozen at that table. Kiara, my God, the food is impeccable tonight as always. But what on earth is the owner doing wearing an apron? The silence that followed Mr. Sterling's booming laugh was not just quiet. It was an absolute airless void. It was the kind of profound, heavy silence that only occurs when a carefully constructed delusion is violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I watched the physical shockwave ripple across the mahogany table, hitting each member of my family with the force of a freight train. Carlton's jaw literally unhinged. The confident, booming patriarch, who just minutes ago threatened to throw me out the back door, now looked like a deflated balloon. The color completely drained from his face, leaving a sickly grayish ash in its wake. He stared at Mr. Sterling, and then at me, his eyes darting frantically, as if his brain was desperately trying to reboot a crashed operating system. Beside him, Vivian lost her iron grip on her carefully curated high society facade. The heavy silver fork slipped from her trembling fingers and crashed onto her imported porcelain plate with a loud jarring clatter that echoed off the acoustic paneling. She did not even flinch at the sharp noise. Her perfectly manicured hands hovered frozen in midair, her mouth slightly open in an undignified mask of pure disbelief. All her boasting about country club legacies and her obsession with status suddenly meant nothing. And Connor looked like he was going to violently vomit right there on his frayed tailored suit. His pale skin took on a sickly greenish hue, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. The arrogant white savior of the Brown family had just realized that the woman he tried to humiliate by snapping his fingers was actually standing at the very top of the Atlanta commercial real estate food chain, the very food chain he had just bankrupted himself trying to climb. He had demanded I recite French wine labels to prove my intelligence, and now he was suffocating under the realization that I owned the ground beneath his feet. The shift in power was so tangible you could taste the metallic tang of fear in the air. But a delusion built over 3 decades does not die without a vicious fight. Jasmine was the first to break the suffocating silence. Her entire identity and her unearned sense of superiority relied completely on my designated role as the family failure. If I was not at the absolute bottom, she could not be at the top. She gripped the edge of the dining table, her knuckles turning stark white as she fought to keep her fabricated reality intact. "Owner," she stammered, her voice trembling with a frantic, desperate denial. "Mr. Sterling, you are clearly mistaken. You must be confusing her with someone else. A managing partner, maybe, or a brand ambassador for the restaurant." She let out a high-pitched, hysterical laugh that sounded exactly like glass breaking. "She is my sister. She is a college dropout. She could not handle the pressure of law school, so she quit to cook. She is just a waiter. She just pours water and takes orders. Look at her uniform." Jasmine pointed a shaking acrylic nail at my black apron. She was clinging to that piece of fabric like it was a life preserver in a Category 5 hurricane. She desperately needed me to be a servant so she could remain the golden child. She needed the narrative our parents spun to be the absolute truth, because without it she was just a woman married to a broke fraud. "You are being polite because you are a gentleman," Jasmine continued, her voice pitching higher and higher as panic set in. "But my sister does not own anything. She is literally standing here sweeping up broken glass because I told her to." Mr. Sterling turned his head slowly to look at my sister. The warm, jovial expression he had worn while embracing me vanished instantly, replaced by the icy, ruthless demeanor of a billionaire who does not tolerate foolishness from amateurs. He looked at Jasmine like she had completely lost her mind. He looked at her the way a seasoned predator looks at a very loud, very annoying insect. "A waiter." Sterling repeated the word slowly, letting the absolute absurdity of it hang heavy in the VIP room. He let out a sharp, humorless scoff that made Carlton physically flinch. "Young woman, you are speaking about Kiara. Kiara owns the Obsidian Room outright. She does not just manage it, she does not just consult for it. She is the sole proprietor and visionary of this establishment." Sterling took a slow, deliberate step toward the table, placing his hands flat on the polished mahogany and leaning in toward my father. "But that is just her passion project." Sterling continued, his voice ringing with undeniable authority. "She is the primary shareholder of this entire building. She owns the 3 luxury commercial high-rises currently dominating the Midtown skyline. And more importantly, Carlton, she is the founding partner and head of Vanguard Equity, the exact venture capital fund you are currently begging for a financial lifeline." Carlton let out a strangled gasp. He gripped his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as the walls closed in on him. Vanguard Equity was the firm he had been pitching for 6 months. He had sent countless emails, blind pitches, and desperate voicemails to their anonymous executive board. He had leveraged his last remaining assets to secure this private dinner meeting with Sterling, fully believing Sterling was the sole decision-maker who could save his failing logistics empire. Sterling stood up straight, shaking his head in absolute disgust. "Tell me, Carlton," Sterling said, his tone dripping with professional contempt. "Did you even bother to read the corporate disclosure paperwork before you brought your failing logistics pitch to my office last week? Did you actually review the ownership structure of the fund you are asking to save your estate? If you had done even a fraction of the required due diligence, you would have seen Kiara's signature on every single page of the master agreement. I am just a minority partner, Carlton. Kiara is the one who holds the heavy capital. Kiara makes the final call on every single investment we fund." The realization hit my father with the brute force of a physical blow. His eyes widened to the point of bulging as he stared at me. The daughter he threw away 5 years ago was now standing before him as a financial titan. The daughter he mocked and belittled for choosing the culinary arts over a stuffy law firm had built an empire that dwarfed his entire life's work. The daughter he just threatened to have fired and tossed out the back door for insubordination was the anonymous billionaire investor he had been chasing for half a year. The venture capital he desperately needed to save his home, his status, and his fake legacy was sitting entirely in my bank accounts. I watched the exact moment Carlton realized he was completely at my mercy. His shoulders slumped, and the arrogant posture he maintained for 33 years dissolved into nothing. Vivian sat paralyzed, her eyes darting between me and Sterling, unable to form a single coherent sentence. Her worst nightmare had come true. The child she deemed a blue-collar embarrassment was the wealthiest person in the room. I stepped forward, moving out of the shadows of the service station and right into the center of the room. The power dynamic had permanently shifted. There was no more hiding behind polite service protocols. There was no more playing the obedient server to appease their inflated egos. I was done letting them believe they held any authority over my existence. I reached behind my back and calmly untied the knot of my black apron. I pulled the heavy fabric over my head, moving with deliberate, unhurried precision. I folded the apron neatly in half and draped it perfectly over my left arm. Beneath it, I was wearing a sharply tailored silk blouse and bespoke trousers that cost more than Jasmine's entire wardrobe. I transformed from their servant to their superior in a matter of seconds. I walked directly to the head of the table, standing exactly where my father had been pacing a few minutes ago. I looked down at Carlton, watching him sweat and tremble under the crushing weight of his own profound ignorance and catastrophic arrogance. I held his gaze, refusing to let him look away from the woman I had become. I wanted him to see the empire I built without a single dime of his money or a single ounce of his support. I told you I was not just fetching water, Dad. The complete evaporation of their arrogance happened so fast it was almost a biological marvel. I watched the rigid, judgmental posture drain right out of my mother's spine. For my entire life, Vivian had operated with a spine made of pure steel and country club elitism, always looking down her nose at anyone who did not meet her exact socio-economic requirements. Now realizing that her entire luxury lifestyle, her diamond necklaces, and her precious social standing rested solely in the palm of the daughter she had thrown away, that steel spine melted into absolute jelly. She scrambled up from her heavy leather dining chair. Her designer heels clicked frantically against the imported hardwood floor as she rushed around the mahogany table. The sneer of disgust she had worn since the moment she walked into my restaurant was completely wiped away. In its place, she pasted on a mask of overwhelming, frantic maternal affection that was so deeply fabricated it made my stomach turn. Her eyes, previously narrowed with malice, were now wide and brimming with forced theatrical tears. She reached out both arms, extended her heavy bracelets clinking together as she attempted to grab my hands. "Oh, my brilliant girl!" Vivian cried out, her voice pitching into a sickeningly sweet frequency she usually reserved for the wives of state senators. "I always knew you had a genius mind for business. I always knew it deep down in my heart. I did not just stand there. I took a sharp, deliberate step backward, putting a solid foot of physical distance between us." The sheer force of my rejection hit her like a physical wall, leaving her hands grasping at empty air. Vivian refused to drop the act. She pressed her hands to her chest, playing the role of the overwhelmed, proud mother. "You have to understand, Kiara," she pleaded, her eyes darting frantically toward Mr. Sterling, desperate to convince the billionaire investor that she was a supportive parent. "When we pushed you away, when we told you to leave the house, it was not because we did not love you. We were just giving you tough love to push you to greatness. We knew that if we made you comfortable, you would never tap into your true potential. We saw the fire in you. We had to be harsh so you would build all of this. We did this for you, baby. We made you strong." The absolute audacity of her manipulation was staggering. She was standing in the middle of my empire, attempting to take credit for the very success I built while recovering from the trauma of her abandonment. She wanted Mr. Sterling and everyone else in the room to believe that kicking me out onto the street, cutting off my phone plan, and telling the rest of the extended family that I was a lost cause was actually a masterclass in strategic parenting. I looked at her outstretched hands, then up at her desperately pleading face. A cold, absolute calm washed over me. I felt no anger anymore, only a clinical, dissecting clarity. "Do not touch me," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried the lethal, quiet authority of a woman who commands boardrooms. Vivian flinched, pulling her hands back slightly, but she maintained her wide, tearful gaze. 10 minutes ago, I was poor trash ruining the family name. I continued enunciating every single word so it echoed clearly in the silent VIP room. 10 minutes ago, you sat in that chair and loudly announced that I was a blue-collar embarrassment. You told your son-in-law that it was a massive shame I threw my life away to fetch hot plates. You looked at me with pure disgust and told me my existence was a humiliation to your country club legacy. I took a slow, measured step forward, forcing Vivian to shrink back. And now I am your brilliant girl. Now that you realize I own the building you are standing in, suddenly my culinary career is a stroke of genius. You do not get to claim my victory, Mother. You changed the locks on my childhood home while I was pulling a double shift at a bakery. You told Aunt Sarah I was a disgrace who would end up begging on the streets. You did not give me tough love. You gave me nothing. I built this empire in spite of you, not because of you. Across the table, Jasmine let out a sharp, panicked breath. The golden child was watching her entire universe capsize. For 3 decades, Jasmine's security rested entirely on the fact that Vivian and Carlton favored her over me. She had blindly followed their rules, married the white corporate executive they approved of, and soaked up their financial backing. Now she was watching her mother completely abandon that allegiance. Vivian was openly discarding Jasmine's fabricated superiority to grovel at the feet of the scapegoat. Jasmine looked at Connor, her husband, who was currently sweating profusely and staring at the floor, offering absolutely zero protection or solutions. The alliance that had tormented me for my entire life was fracturing into a million jagged pieces. But the most pathetic display of the evening did not come from my mother or my sister. It came from the patriarch himself. Carlton had been standing frozen near his chair, his mind desperately calculating the catastrophic math of his current reality. He was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. His logistics firm was drowning in debt. His son-in-law had squandered $500,000 of his capital on a bankrupt real estate venture. The bank was circling his Buckhead estate, and the one anonymous venture capital fund he had spent 6 months aggressively courting was entirely controlled by the daughter he had just tried to get fired. The sheer terror of losing his wealth and his status finally snapped him out of his paralysis. He realized that Vivian's emotional manipulation was failing miserably. He needed to pivot, and he needed to pivot hard. Carlton lunged forward. He physically pushed Vivian aside, his large hand shoving her shoulder out of the way with a startling lack of grace. Vivian stumbled in her designer heels, letting out a shocked gasp, but Carlton did not even look at her. The polished, composed, terrifying father of my youth was completely gone. The man standing before me was nothing but a desperate, terrified debtor begging for his life. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and wide with sheer financial panic. The vein in his forehead that usually bulged with anger was now throbbing with pure terror. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany dining table, leaning his entire body weight toward me. "Kiara, you have to save the family firm," Carlton pleaded. His voice cracked, stripping away decades of authoritarian pride. He was breathing heavily, his tailored suit jacket hanging awkwardly on his frame. "You have to sign the Vanguard equity investment deal tonight. I know we have our differences. I know I was harsh earlier. But this is business, Kiara. You are a businesswoman now. You understand how the market works." He did not wait for me to answer. He immediately turned his frantic, wild eyes toward the opposite end of the table. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at Connor. "Connor ruined us!" Carlton shouted, his voice echoing off the acoustic paneling. He completely threw his chosen son-in-law straight under the bus without a single second of hesitation. He lied to me. He fabricated his financial statements. He took my capital and flushed it down the drain on a dead commercial zone. He is a fraud, Kiara. He manipulated this entire family. I am a victim of his incompetence. Connor jolted in his chair, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Carlton, you cannot be serious." Connor stammered, raising his hands in weak defense. We made that investment decision together. You reviewed the term sheets. Shut your mouth! Carlton roared, cutting him off with absolute venom. You are nothing but a parasite. You bankrupted your own holding company and tried to drag my legacy down with you. Carlton turned back to me, his expression morphing from rage back to pathetic desperation. He clasped his hands together in a prayer-like motion right in front of his chest. It was a gesture of total submission from a man who used to demand that I address him as Sir. Do not let his failures destroy the Brown family name, Carlton begged, sweat actively dripping from his brow. I built that logistics company from the ground up, Kiara. It is our legacy. It is your legacy. If Vanguard does not inject capital into my operating accounts by Friday, the creditors are going to seize the warehouses. They are going to take the house in Buckhead. Your mother and sister will be out on the street. He took a step closer, his eyes pleading desperately, trying to invoke the ultimate toxic trump card of every dysfunctional household. He reached out, hovering his hand just inches from my arm, too afraid of my power to actually make contact. You cannot let that happen to us, he whispered, his voice trembling with raw, unfiltered fear. Kiara, you have to save the family firm. Connor ruined us. We are your blood. I watched the sweat bead on my father's forehead as he practically threw himself over the mahogany table. His desperate plea about blood and family hung in the air like foul smoke in my pristine dining room. But Carlton was a man who only survived his own failures by ensuring someone else took the fall. For 33 years, that designated scapegoat had been me. Today, he needed a new target, and the arrogant white son-in-law sitting across the table was bleeding out right on cue. Carlton spun around and pointed a rigid, trembling finger directly at Connor's face. He completely abandoned any remaining pretense of upper-class solidarity. This arrogant fraud lied to me, Carlton roared, his voice echoing off the acoustic paneling. He walked into my home, drank my premium liquor, married my eldest daughter, and used my company's pristine credit rating to fund a ghost project in Midtown. He swore the commercial development was a guaranteed return. He showed me fabricated financial projections. He took a massive bridge loan under my corporate umbrella and blew it all on a dead zone. I am a victim of his systemic incompetence. Connor shrank back into the heavy leather chair, his face a sickly pale mask of absolute terror. He raised his hands in a weak, defensive gesture, completely stripped of the smug superiority he had paraded around just 20 minutes ago. Carlton, it was a market shift. Connor stammered, his voice pitching high and thin. The city planners backed out at the last second. It was an unpredictable variable. I did not defraud you. We took a calculated risk and the market turned against us. A calculated risk, Carlton spat, slamming his fist against the table. You bankrupted your own holding company and tried to use my legacy as a human shield. You are a financial parasite. The reality of the situation finally pierced through Jasmine's thick layer of materialistic delusion. My sister sat frozen, her wide eyes darting between her raging father and her cowering husband. The golden child was watching her entire fabricated universe burn to ash. Her identity was entirely dependent on her status as a wealthy, prominent socialite. She had married Connor because he represented a specific type of corporate security that allowed her to look down on everyone else, especially me. Now she was forced to confront the fact that her luxurious lifestyle was a complete illusion, funded by my father's dwindling bank accounts and her husband's criminal negligence. Jasmine grabbed Connor's arm, her perfectly manicured acrylic nails digging fiercely into the fabric of his tailored suit. You told me the bank made a clerical error? Jasmine shrieked, her voice entirely devoid of its usual melodic sweetness. When my card was declined at Neiman Marcus, you looked me in the eyes and swore it was a security flag on the account. You promised me the new house in Buckhead was closing next week. Are you telling me we are broke? Are you telling me we have absolutely nothing? Connor could not even look his wife in the eye. He stared down at the shattered crystal and the puddle of sparkling water near his expensive leather shoes. Jasmine, please keep your voice down, he mumbled miserably. We just need a temporary influx of capital. We just need to restructure the debt. You lied to me, Jasmine screamed, shoving his shoulder hard enough to make him stumble in his seat. I am going to be a laughingstock at the country club. My friends are going to know my husband is a bankrupt failure. I am going to lose everything because you are a pathetic liar." Vivian sat paralyzed in her chair, completely unable to intervene. The matriarch who had spent her entire life orchestrating the perfect family image was now trapped in the front row of its violent implosion. She looked at Mr. Sterling, who stood silently near the doorway, observing the chaos with the cold, analytical eye of a man who evaluates risk for a living. Vivian realized that every single scream and accusation further guaranteed that Sterling would never do business with them again. But Carlton could not process the finality of his ruin. His desperation suddenly morphed into a chilling display of toxic patriarchal entitlement. He adjusted his suit jacket, pulling at the lapels, in a frantic attempt to reclaim his shattered authority. He took a deep breath, forcing his chest to expand, and turned his attention back to me. The groveling panic in his eyes receded, replaced by a heavy, demanding expectation. He genuinely believed that because he provided half the genetic material required for my existence, I was automatically obligated to sacrifice my hard-earned empire to save his failing one. "You see what I am dealing with, Kiara?" Carlton said, his tone shifting from frantic beggar to commanding father. "You see how I have been manipulated and betrayed by people I trusted. This is why blood is the only thing that matters. This is why family must stick together when the world turns against us." He took a step towards me, expecting me to fall right back into the role of the obedient daughter, desperate for his validation. "You have the capital, Kiara," he stated, as if managing my finances was his inherent right. "You are the head of Vanguard Equity. You can authorize the bridge loan tonight. We can draw up the term sheets right here in this room. You can wire the funds to my operating accounts by tomorrow morning and stabilize the logistics firm. We can absorb the losses Connor caused and push him out of the board entirely." I stared at him, maintaining my perfectly neutral expression. The sheer audacity was almost breathtaking. "You owe it to the name I gave you," Carlton continued, his voice dropping into a low, persuasive cadence. "I am your father. I put a roof over your head. I gave you the foundation to become the woman you are today. You are a businesswoman now. You know that letting a legacy business collapse is bad for everyone. You have the power to fix this right now. Family protects family, Kiara. It is time for you to step up and do your duty." I listened to his demands while a cold, clinical calm washed over my entire body. I looked at the man who had mocked my dreams, ridiculed my work ethic, and banished me from his home simply because I refused to be his corporate trophy. I looked at the mother who had smirked while he called me poor trash just 30 minutes ago. I looked at the sister who had intentionally shattered a glass on my floor, demanding I get on my knees to clean it. They did not see me as a person. They did not respect my achievements. They only saw me as an unlocked vault of cash sent to rescue them from the consequences of their own toxic arrogance. I gave a subtle nod to Elias, who immediately took a strategic step back, allowing me the floor. I turned on my heel and walked deliberately away from the dining table. My heels clicked with sharp, steady rhythm against the hardwood as I approached the heavy mahogany host podium positioned near the entrance of the VIP room. I reached into the storage shelf beneath the podium. My fingers brushed the smooth, expensive leather of the dossier I had prepared hours before service began. I pulled out a sleek black leather folder. It was thick, heavy, and contained every single piece of leverage I needed to execute this moment flawlessly. I walked back to the center of the room. Carlton watched me with eager anticipation, clearly mistaking my silence for submission. He actually believed I was retrieving the venture capital term sheets. He actually thought I was going to hand over my millions to save his crumbling facade. I stopped directly across from my father. I did not hand the folder to him. I raised it slightly and tossed it flat onto the center of the dining table. The heavy leather hit the polished wood with a loud, solid thud that made Vivian flinch. I locked eyes with Carlton, letting all the icy authority I had built over the last 4 years radiate through my gaze. "I did not just review your investment pitch, Dad," I said, my voice low, sharp, and echoing clearly through the dead silence of the room. "I audited your entire company. Let us talk about your illegal tax write-offs, shall we?" I flipped open the heavy cover of the dossier. The crisp white pages inside contained the absolute destruction of Carlton Brown and his logistics empire. I did not look at him as I ran my finger down the first column of numbers. I looked directly at the first highlighted paragraph. Let us start with the third quarter of last year, I said, my voice echoing sharply in the silent room. You claimed a $2 million operational loss due to supply chain disruptions, but my forensic accountants found exactly where that money went. You and Connor created 3 shell companies registered in Delaware. You routed those company funds out of your primary business accounts and funneled them directly into Connor's real estate holding company to cover his failing Midtown project. You categorized it as consulting fees. That is not a business strategy. That is felony embezzlement. Carlton lunged forward. His hands slapped violently against the mahogany table as if he could physically grab the words out of the air and force them back into my mouth. Kiara, shut your mouth this instant, he hissed. His eyes darted frantically toward Mr. Sterling, desperate to contain the radioactive fallout. You do not know what you are talking about. It was a complex corporate restructuring. Mr. Sterling, please, you understand how these internal transfers work in our industry. She is just a disgruntled child trying to cause a scene because we had a disagreement. Mr. Sterling did not move a single muscle to help him. The billionaire venture capitalist simply leaned casually against the heavy oak doors, crossing his arms over his bespoke charcoal suit. He looked at my father with the kind of clinical detachment a scientist reserves for an interesting specimen under a microscope. Then Sterling looked at me and gave a slow, approving nod. He was watching a masterclass in corporate execution, and he was thoroughly enjoying the show. He knew I had done the work. He knew my numbers were flawless. I turned the page of my dossier, ignoring my father completely. I also have the records of your extensive tax fraud. I continued, projecting my voice effortlessly over Carlton's frantic sputtering. You claimed your luxury vehicles, Vivian's country club memberships, and Jasmine's gated Buckhead mortgage as corporate logistical expenses. You classified your own daughter's personal home as a regional distribution hub to dodge federal taxes. You subsidized your entire fake luxury lifestyle using company money that was supposed to pay your vendors. If the Internal Revenue Service audits this firm, and they will because I have already compiled the exact documentation they need, you will not just lose your company. You will lose your freedom. The word freedom hung in the air like an executioner's blade falling in slow motion. The sheer weight of that single word finally crashed through Jasmine's thick layer of entitlement. My sister snapped. The golden child who had spent her entire life believing she was vastly superior to me suddenly realized she was entirely dependent on stolen money. She spun around and shoved Connor hard in the chest, her perfectly manicured hands striking his expensive ruined suit. You told me we were rich! Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that shattered the elegant atmosphere of the private dining room. You told me the Midtown project was a guaranteed gold mine. You used my father's money to fund your fake lifestyle, and you put my house in jeopardy. You put my name on fraudulent tax documents. You let me walk into designer stores and get my credit cards declined while you were secretly bankrupt. Connor stumbled backward, his face slick with terrified sweat. The arrogant white brother-in-law who had snapped his fingers at me and demanded I recite French wine labels was now cowering before his furious wife. He raised his hands desperately, trying to fend off her physical attacks. Jasmine, calm down. It was his idea, Connor yelled, pointing a shaking, desperate finger right back at Carlton. Your father knew the logistics firm was dying. He came to me. He begged me to help him hide the assets in my real estate holding company so his corporate creditors could not touch it. He authorized every single transfer. I am just the managing partner. He is the one who signed the fraudulent checks. He used us to save himself. You lying parasite, Carlton roared, completely abandoning his polished patriarch persona. You promised me a 30% return. You manipulated my accounts and drained my liquidity. You swore the zoning board was in your pocket. The two men who had spent my entire life bonding over their shared superiority and their mutual disdain for my choices were now viciously tearing each other apart, to avoid a federal prison sentence. There was no loyalty among thieves. The moment the money evaporated, they turned into wild animals, fighting over the scraps of a ruined empire. Jasmine was sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She realized she was married to a broke, incompetent criminal, and her father was no longer the untouchable titan of Atlanta society. Her entire world was a crime scene, and she was holding the bag. I stood perfectly still watching them destroy each other. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth I had unearthed was doing all the heavy lifting for me. Every single insult they had hurled at me over the years, every time they called me trash, every time they laughed at my apron, it all circled back to this exact moment. They had built a fortress of lies, and I had just handed them the match to burn it down. Vivian could not handle the destruction of her pristine image. The country club matriarch saw her legacy turning into a high-profile scandal right in front of a billionaire investor. Her mind could not process the legal and financial reality of what I had just exposed, so she defaulted to the only weapon she had left: emotional manipulation. She scrambled around the table, her hands clutching her chest as tears streamed down her face. She positioned herself between me and the arguing men, trying to physically shield her husband and her crumbling reality from the devastating truth of his own actions. She looked at me with wide, betrayed eyes, weaponizing her tears for one final desperate performance. "How can you do this to your own family in front of a stranger?" Vivian cried, her voice cracking with manufactured heartbreak. "You are destroying us." I looked down at my mother. Vivian was clutching her chest with both hands, her heavy diamond necklace catching the warm, ambient light of the private dining room. Hot tears streamed down her meticulously powdered cheeks, leaving dark, ugly streaks of expensive mascara in their wake. She fully expected her weeping to act as an impenetrable shield, just like it always did when we were growing up. Whenever my father went too far with his rigid, suffocating demands, or whenever Jasmine bullied me into a corner with her petty cruelties, Vivian would cry. She would weep and claim that my defensive reactions were tearing the family apart, turning herself into the ultimate victim to silence any accountability. It was her favorite weapon, a masterful performance designed to make me feel guilty for simply existing outside of their perfect mold. But those tears held absolutely no power over me anymore. I felt absolute ice in my veins. I did not soften my posture. I did not reach out to comfort her. I let the heavy silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment, forcing her to sit in the suffocating discomfort of her own transparent manipulation. "You are destroying us," she sobbed again, her voice pitching into a shrill, theatrical wail that bounced off the acoustic wood paneling. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, planting my heels firmly on the hardwood floor. "I am not destroying you," I said, my voice completely level and devoid of any maternal warmth. "You destroyed yourselves the moment you decided that keeping up appearances was more important than basic integrity. You destroyed yourselves when you funded a fraudulent lifestyle with stolen money just to impress high society people who do not even care if you live or die. Do not dare play the victim tonight, Vivian. I am not ruining this family. I am just reading the receipts." Vivian recoiled as if I had physically struck her across the face. She looked to my father for backup, desperately seeking the patriarchal protection that had always shielded her from consequence. But Carlton was entirely paralyzed by the financial ruin staring him directly in the face. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above his tight, sweat-soaked collar. He tried to straighten his slumping shoulders, attempting to summon the ghosts of his former authority, but he just looked pathetic. A broken old man wearing a suit he could no longer afford. "Kiara, please," Carlton rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel crushing together. "We can fix the internal accounts. We can execute a hostile takeover and push Connor out of the board entirely. You have the capital to stabilize the logistics firm. If Vanguard Equity injects the necessary funds, we can restructure the debt and keep the Buckhead estate. We just need an angel investor to bridge the gap." I looked at him, feeling a deep, profound sense of revulsion for the man who used to terrify me. You want me to invest in a sinking ship piloted by a thief and an enabler, I asked, letting a harsh, humorless laugh escape my chest. You stood by and authorized fraudulent transfers because you were too arrogant to admit your business model was utterly obsolete. You let your white son-in-law gamble away your assets because you worshipped his proximity to old money and generational wealth. You threw away your own black daughter to cater to a fraud. And now you expect the very daughter you discarded to write a blank check to cover your criminal negligence. The sheer blinding entitlement is staggering. I leaned slightly over the polished mahogany table, locking my eyes directly onto his terrified, bloodshot gaze. Actually, I did not come here tonight to invest. A new, deeply chilling kind of panic washed over Carlton's face. The confusion radiating from him was palpable. If I was not here to invest, if I was not here to save his failing logistics firm with a massive injection of cash, why was I standing here revealing their financial crimes in front of a billionaire witness? Jasmine stopped her hysterical sobbing for a fraction of a second, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute confusion. Connor pressed his body further back into his leather dining chair, trying to make himself as small as possible, looking exactly like a cornered animal, waiting for the final fatal blow. I reached my hand back into the sleek black leather folder resting on the table. The heavy parchment paper rustled softly in the quiet room. Mr. Sterling shifted his stance near the heavy oak doors, watching my every move with a sharp, deeply appreciative gleam in his eye. He knew exactly what kind of play I was making. It was a ruthless, flawless strategy we had discussed in his private downtown office just last month, when I told him it was time to aggressively diversify my holdings. I pulled out a second legal document, a thick stack of contracts bound together with a dark blue corporate seal. It was not a term sheet for venture capital. It was a finalized, legally binding deed of transfer. I did not just build a hospitality empire, I said, my voice carrying the steady, relentless rhythm of a descending hammer. Restaurants generate massive amounts of liquid capital, but real wealth, the kind of wealth that builds untouchable generational power, requires owning the actual ground underneath those restaurants. I spent the last 3 years quietly acquiring premium commercial property across the city, building an ironclad network of hard assets that you were too busy looking down on me to notice. I held the document up so the harsh lighting of the crystal chandelier illuminated the bold black text at the top of the page. You see, Carlton, while you were busy taking out predatory bridge loans to cover Connor's catastrophic mistakes, my holding company was aggressively liquidating cash to make a major acquisition. I placed the document flat on the table right next to his empty dinner plate. 2 weeks ago, my holding company bought out the commercial real estate portfolio of downtown Atlanta. The words seemed to physically strike him in the chest. He blinked rapidly, his mind desperately trying to process the massive magnitude of what I was saying. The portfolio I had just acquired was absolutely legendary in the Atlanta commercial business circuit. It was a massive collection of premium corporate real estate that had been fiercely controlled by an old money conglomerate for decades. The acquisition had made front-page headlines in every financial publication in the state, but the buyer had been deliberately listed through a complex maze of anonymous shell companies to protect my privacy. I watched my father's shaking eyes scan the visible text on the legal document, reading my full legal name, stamped boldly, as the sole managing director of the acquiring entity. You bought the downtown sector. Carlton whispered, his voice completely hollow-sounding, as if his soul had just left his body. He knew the precise, staggering value of that portfolio. He knew it required hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid assets to even secure a seat at the negotiating table. He finally understood the sheer, undeniable scale of my financial power. Yes, I confirmed, my tone razor-sharp and entirely unforgiving. And that portfolio contains 32 premium corporate properties. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch for one agonizing second, making absolutely certain he was hanging on to my every single word before I delivered the final fatal strike. That includes the high-rise building where your logistics firm is headquartered. I pushed the thick stack of legal documents across the smooth mahogany wood. It slid with a heavy scratching sound, stopping exactly an inch from his pristine dinner plate. Carlton stared at the bold black lettering on the top page like it was a live explosive. He reached out with trembling fingers. I watched his bloodshot eyes scan the official header. I made absolutely sure my legal team used the heaviest, most expensive paper stock available for this specific document. It was the exact same grade of paper he used when he served me with formal disownment papers 4 years ago. I wanted him to feel the poetic justice physically resting in his hands. "You are 6 months behind on rent," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the acoustic paneling of the VIP room. "You thought you could hide your insolvency by moving funds through offshore accounts and shell companies. But commercial landlords have full legal access to tenant financial arrears. You do not own that high-rise, Carlton. You just lease the space to project an image of corporate stability you do not actually possess. As your new landlord, I am officially serving you a 7-day eviction notice. You have 1 week to clear your logistics firm out of my building before I send the marshals to seize your remaining assets." Carlton collapsed backward into his heavy leather dining chair. All the air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, pathetic gasp. The formidable patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist for my entire life was completely eradicated in a matter of seconds. For 3 decades, he had used his financial leverage to dictate my worth. He had conditioned me to believe that a black woman without a corporate law degree from an Ivy League school was utterly useless to society. He demanded absolute obedience and punished any deviation with swift financial exile. Now the daughter he deemed too low class to sit at his table held the literal deed to his entire professional legacy. He had absolutely nothing left to threaten me with. The power dynamic did not just shift, it was permanently obliterated. He stared at the eviction notice, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was no longer a towering titan of Atlanta society. He was just a delinquent tenant who could not pay his bills. I did not give my father a single second to recover his breath. I turned my attention sharply to my left. Connor was actively sweating through the stiff collar of his tailored suit. The arrogant white brother-in-law who had snapped his fingers in my face and demanded I fetch the reserve wine list was now shaking uncontrollably. He looked wildly at the heavy oak doors, clearly calculating his chances of simply running out of the restaurant to escape the nightmare closing in on him. I took a deliberate step toward him, blocking his line of sight to the exit. "And Connor," I said, locking my eyes onto his terrified, pale face, "you really should have paid closer attention to the digital trail left by your shell companies. When my holding company acquired the commercial real estate portfolio, we also acquired the right to audit the extensive financial histories of our commercial tenants. My corporate forensic accountants found every single fraudulent transfer you made from my father's operating accounts into your personal LLC." Connor opened his mouth to formulate a lie, but his voice completely failed him. He raised a trembling hand as if he could physically push my words away. He had built his entire identity on the delusion that he was the smartest man in the room. He believed he could effortlessly manipulate an older black businessman, and he completely dismissed a black woman wearing a service apron. His arrogant prejudice was the exact blind spot I used to dismantle him. We did not just keep those financial records for our own amusement. I continued, my tone conversational, but absolutely lethal. My legal team has already forwarded your complete embezzlement history, your falsified bank statements, and your illegal tax write-offs directly to the IRS and the federal prosecutor's office in downtown Atlanta. You will not be needing venture capital tonight, Connor. You will be needing a very expensive criminal defense attorney. Jasmine let out a piercing, horrified shriek. She shoved her dining chair violently away from the table, creating as much physical distance as possible between herself and the man she had proudly flaunted all evening. The golden child finally understood the catastrophic reality of her situation. Her husband was not a wealthy real estate mogul. He was a federal criminal who had just destroyed her family's entire fortune. The country club memberships, the designer shoes, the gated community in Buckhead were all funded by wire fraud and tax evasion. She looked at Connor with pure, unadulterated hatred, realizing she would have to explain his federal indictment to her elite social circle. Vivian could no longer sustain the delusion. The matriarch who had spent her entire adult life curating an image of flawless upper-class excellence was witnessing her reality burn to the ground. She realized that demanding obedience from me had failed. She realized that throwing a temper tantrum and screaming about respect had failed. She saw Mr. Sterling watching the entire scene with quiet approval entirely on my side. She had only one weapon left in her entire manipulative arsenal. Vivian stepped out from behind her chair. The woman who prized her dignity and social standing above the mental health of her own children did the unthinkable. She dropped her designer handbag onto the hardwood floor. Then she bent her knees and collapsed entirely. She dropped to her knees right there in the middle of my dining room. It was a massive, unprecedented shift for a buckhead socialite who refused to even wear flat shoes in public. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, looking up at me through a thick mask of streaming tears. "Kiara, please." Vivian wept, her voice cracking with raw, desperate emotion. "How can you do this to us? I am your mother. Please, baby, you have to remember the times I cared for you when you were a little girl. You cannot just throw us away." I looked down at my mother. Vivian remained on her knees, pressing her perfectly manicured hands together in a posture of desperate, frantic prayer. Her heavy diamond necklace sparked mockingly under the warm ambient light of the crystal chandelier, while dark, ugly streaks of mascara ruined her meticulously powdered face. She was weeping loudly, making absolutely sure the acoustics of the private dining room amplified her manufactured heartbreak. For my entire life, those theatrical tears had been her ultimate weapon. They were the universal family signal that I needed to surrender, that I needed to immediately shrink myself to accommodate her incredibly fragile ego. She fully expected me to reach down, pull her up by her designer dress, and sacrifice my hard-earned empire just to dry her fake tears. She wanted me to save her from the very consequences she helped create. I felt absolutely nothing. I felt no pity. I felt no residual daughterly guilt. I only felt a profound, overwhelming sense of closure. The invisible, toxic chains of obligation that had choked me for 3 decades simply snapped, leaving me feeling lighter than I had ever felt in my entire life. "You want me to remember the times you cared for me?" I asked, my voice echoing with icy surgical precision. Vivian nodded frantically, gasping for air, playing the role of the devoted, terrified matriarch to absolute perfection. "Yes, baby," she sobbed, reaching a trembling hand out to grab the hem of my trousers. "We are your family. I am your mother. You cannot do this to us." I took a sharp step back, refusing to let her touch me. "Let us talk about your specific version of maternal care." I continued holding my ground as she knelt, pathetic and small, before me. "Let us talk about a rainy Tuesday night exactly 4 years ago. I had just formally withdrawn from the corporate law program. I drove straight to the Buckhead estate, terrified, exhausted, and feeling like a complete failure. I was hoping my family would give me a single night of grace, a single warm meal to help me figure out my next move. I stood on your massive front porch, shivering in the freezing rain, holding a single duffel bag containing everything I owned. The room went deathly quiet. Jasmine stopped wiping her own tears, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. Connor squeezed his eyes shut, sweating profusely in his ruined suit. Carlton stood frozen by the table, unable to intervene. "You opened the heavy mahogany front door wearing your expensive silk robe," I stated, refusing to let Vivian look away from my face. "You looked at my wet clothes and my tear-stained face. Do you remember exactly what you did next, Vivian?" Vivian froze, her loud weeping suddenly halting as the psychological trap sprang firmly shut. She lowered her trembling hands, her eyes darting nervously toward Carlton, and then toward Mr. Sterling, who was watching the exchange with intense, silent scrutiny. I remember it with absolute crystal clarity. I said, my tone dropping into a lethal calm. "You did not invite me inside. You did not ask if I had eaten or if I was safe driving in the storm. You stepped squarely into the doorway, physically blocking the warmth of the house. You looked me directly in the eyes and said that I was a complete embarrassment to the family legacy." You said that quitting law school to work in commercial kitchens was a blue-collar disgrace you would never tolerate under your roof. You told me I was a stain on the Brown family name. You reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. You said you made your bed in the gutter, now lie in it. Then you slammed the door directly in my face and locked the deadbolt. Vivian opened her mouth to argue, to fabricate an excuse, but the words completely died in her throat. The undeniable truth of her own horrific cruelty hung heavily in the air, completely destroying the tragic mother narrative she was desperately trying to spin for the billionaire investor in the room. You left me in the freezing rain to sleep in my car, I continued, my voice rising with undeniable, unyielding authority. You actively told Aunt Sarah and the rest of your elite country club circuit that I was a lost cause just to protect your own social standing. You chose your fabricated high society image over your own child. You told me to lie in the gutter. I took a slow, deliberate step closer, forcing her to look up at the powerful woman I had become, the woman standing in bespoke silk who owned the very building her husband was currently defaulting on, the woman who held the deed to the commercial portfolio they desperately needed. I did lie in it, I told her softly but with the force of a physical strike. I slept in my car. I worked 80-hour weeks. I burned my hands on hot stoves and scrubbed grease off floors until my knuckles bled. I saved every single penny while you were drinking champagne bought with stolen corporate funds. I built my own bed, and you aren't welcome to sleep in it. Vivian let out a sharp, devastated gasp, collapsing back onto her heels. She covered her face with her hands, finally shedding real, agonizing tears as the reality of her permanent exile fully set in. There would be no joyful reconciliation. There would be no graceful rescue from her daughter. She had thrown away a priceless asset for the sake of appearances, and now she was entirely bankrupt. Jasmine sat completely paralyzed in her leather dining chair, watching her mother crumble. The golden child finally understood that the protective shield Vivian always provided was completely shattered. Jasmine realized she was entirely alone, married to a white-collar criminal with absolutely no family wealth left to save her from total ruin. Connor was still sweating silently, accepting his fate as a soon-to-be federally indicted felon, realizing that his arrogant display with the metal credit card had been the final nail in his own coffin. Mr. Sterling had seen absolutely everything he needed to see. The billionaire investor pushed himself off the heavy oak doors and walked confidently back toward the center of the VIP room. He did not spare a single glance for Vivian sobbing on the floor or Connor sweating in his chair. He walked straight up to me, extending his hand with deep, profound professional respect. "Brilliant due diligence," Kiara Sterling said, his booming voice commanding the space. "You executed this audit with absolute perfection. You protected Vanguard equity from a massive toxic liability, and you handled this acquisition masterfully. I will see you at the board meeting on Monday. We have a new commercial development project to discuss, and I value your insight now more than ever." I shook his hand firmly, matching his powerful professional grip. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I replied, maintaining steady, confident eye contact. "Have a wonderful evening." Sterling gave a curt, approving nod. He finally turned his head to look at my father. Carlton was gripping the edge of the mahogany dining table, his knuckles stark white, his face a mask of utter devastation. Sterling looked at him with pure, unfiltered disgust. The kind of look a titan gives an insect right before stepping on it. "I have no interest in doing business with frauds," Sterling stated, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Do not ever contact my offices again, Carlton." Sterling turned on his heel and walked out of the room. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, clicking with a sharp, definitive finality that echoed through the room like a judge's gavel striking a sound block. Carlton Brown watched the doors close on his very last remaining lifeline. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavy and thick with the stench of impending doom. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The realization of his total, absolute ruin was actively, violently washing over him. He had lost the venture capital investment he desperately needed to save his logistics firm. His company was entirely bankrupt. He was about to be officially evicted from his own corporate headquarters, by his own daughter in exactly 7 days. His chosen son-in-law was a criminal who had drained his operational accounts. His wife was weeping pathetically on the floor. His social standing in Atlanta was completely permanently eradicated. The polished, composed patriarch mask violently shattered. Carlton pushed himself away from the table, his chair tipping backward and crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. His hands balled into tight, aggressive fists. His chest heaved as the raw, unfiltered, toxic nature he had spent his entire life hiding behind expensive suits finally clawed its way to the surface. He lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure, hateful rage, completely abandoning any pretense of being a civilized man. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Mr. Sterling, sealing my family inside a tomb of their own making. The finality of that sound snapped the last remaining thread of my father's sanity. Carlton Brown, the man who had demanded total submission from his wife, his daughters, and his business associates for over 3 decades, completely unraveled. He pushed himself back from the polished mahogany table with such violent force that his heavy leather dining chair tipped backward, crashing loudly against the custom-imported hardwood floor. He did not bother to pick it up. He stood there, his chest heaving, his expensive silk tie skewed to the side, his entire carefully curated persona of black corporate excellence disintegrating into pure, unfiltered rage. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my face. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and burning with a toxic, desperate fury. "You think you have won?" Carlton roared, his voice bouncing off the acoustic wood paneling, shattering the refined elegance of the VIP dining room. "You think just because you hoarded some money and bought a few buildings that you are suddenly better than us? You are nothing without this family, Kiara. You are an ungrateful, vindictive child who turned her back on her own blood just to prove a point. You destroyed your sister's marriage tonight. You humiliated your mother. You ruined my legacy. You are a monster." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting easily at my sides, watching the patriarch of my family throw a massive, pathetic temper tantrum in the middle of my restaurant. Carlton took a heavy, stomping step forward, kicking a shard of Jasmine's broken crystal goblet across the floor. "You think your wealth means anything without a family to share it with?" He screamed, the volume of his voice escalating to a frantic, hysterical pitch. "You can buy all the commercial real estate in Atlanta, but you will always be empty inside. You have no husband. You have no legacy of your own. You are sitting on a throne of cold cash completely alone. We gave you everything. I put a roof over your head. I paid for your undergraduate degree. I secured your spot in corporate law so you could actually be somebody in this city, and you threw it all back in my face to cook food like a common laborer. Now you want to use your dirty restaurant money to evict your own father. You are a disgrace to the name I gave you." Vivian, still kneeling on the floor, let out a loud, miserable wail, burying her face in her hands. Jasmine had pressed herself completely into the corner of the room, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to become invisible. Connor was staring blankly at the wall, fully paralyzed by the impending reality of federal prison. But Carlton was entirely focused on me, pouring decades of toxic patriarchal entitlement into every single word. He ranted about respect. He screamed about tradition. He yelled that I owed him a debt of gratitude that could never be repaid, claiming that my business acumen was entirely inherited from his genetics, refusing to acknowledge that I had built my empire by doing the exact opposite of everything he ever taught me. He accused me of orchestrating a malicious conspiracy against him, framing my legitimate real estate acquisition as a targeted, vindictive plot rather than a brilliant corporate strategy. He was practically foaming at the mouth, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The crisp, tailored suit he had worn to impress the billionaire investor was now soaked in nervous sweat, the fabric bunching awkwardly around his shoulders. He looked entirely unhinged, like a wild, cornered animal thrashing blindly against the bars of a cage. I did not raise my voice to interrupt him. I did not offer a single word of defense. I simply stood there and let him yell. I let him scream until his vocal cords grew raw. I watched him expend every last ounce of his frantic, chaotic energy. There was a time many years ago when the sound of his booming, angry voice would make my hands shake. When I was a teenager, a single raised tone from Carlton Brown was enough to make me drop whatever I was holding and scramble to apologize for simply breathing too loudly. I used to shrink myself to avoid triggering his volatile ego. I used to swallow my own ambitions just to keep the peace in his house. But tonight, looking at him thrashing about in my immaculate dining room, I felt absolutely no fear. I only felt a deep, profound pity. He was screaming because volume was the only tool he had left. He had no money, he had no power, he had no leverage. He was trying to bully a multimillionaire mogul using the tactics of a schoolyard tyrant, and it was spectacularly ineffective. Slowly, the reality of my complete indifference began to penetrate his rage. He realized that his screaming was not working. I was not crying. I was not apologizing. I was not rushing to write him a check to calm him down. The more he yelled, the more ridiculous and small he looked. His breathing grew ragged. He took another step forward, opening his mouth to hurl another insult, but the words died in his throat. He was completely out of breath. His chest heaved painfully, and he reached up with a trembling hand to loosen his collar. The deafening volume of his tantrum suddenly collapsed into a heavy, suffocating silence. The contrast was absolute poetry. He was a chaotic, sweaty, disheveled mess standing in the center of an environment engineered for absolute perfection. The soft ambient lighting of the obsidian room illuminated the pathetic reality of his ruin. The faint rhythmic hum of the state-of-the-art climate control system filled the void left by his shouting. Through the thick, soundproofed walls, I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of actual, wealthy, successful patrons enjoying their evening in the main dining area, completely oblivious to the financial funeral happening in the VIP room. My world was thriving, functioning flawlessly, generating immense wealth, while his world was lying dead on my hardwood floor. I let that heavy, humiliating silence stretch out for a long, agonizing minute. I let him stand there panting and sweating, fully absorbing the fact that his patriarchal authority was completely eradicated. When I was absolutely certain he had nothing left to say, I finally moved. I walked slowly over to the mahogany service station where I had placed my folded uniform. I reached out and picked up the crisp black apron. The fabric felt soft and heavy in my hands. It was the very garment that had triggered their disgust just an hour ago. To them, it was a symbol of servitude, a marker of lower-class failure, a reason to mock my existence. To me, it was the armor I wore while I built my kingdom. I held the apron in my right hand and turned back toward the dining table. My heels clicked with a slow, deliberate, lethal rhythm against the floor. Every eye in the room followed my movement. Vivian stopped her weeping, staring up at me from her place on the floor with wide, terrified eyes. Jasmine held her breath, pressing herself harder into the corner. Connor did not even blink, his face a mask of total defeat. I walked right up to the head of the table, stopping directly in front of my father's assigned seat. The overturned leather chair lay abandoned behind me. On the table rested his imported porcelain dinner plate, completely empty, alongside the receipt for the $5,000 bottle of wine he had been forced to pay for. Carlton watched me, his bloodshot eyes tracking my every movement. He tried to straighten his posture desperately, attempting to reclaim a fraction of his lost dignity, but his shoulders remained slumped under the crushing weight of his eviction and his bankruptcy. He looked at the black apron in my hands, a flicker of confusion crossing his exhausted features. I did not hand it to him. I did not say a word about his tantrum. I did not engage with a single one of his ridiculous accusations about family loyalty or blood debts. I simply raised the apron over the table. I let the fabric unfold, cascading downward in a smooth, dark wave. I dropped the apron directly onto his pristine, empty porcelain dinner plate. It landed with a soft, definitive rustle, covering the center of the plate completely. The symbolism hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He had come to my restaurant expecting to feast on my humiliation. He had expected to consume a lavish meal funded by stolen money, all while keeping me positioned beneath his boot. Instead, I was serving him the exact reality he had tried to run from. He was getting absolutely nothing from me but the uniform he had so aggressively mocked. I looked up from the table, locking my eyes directly onto my father's defeated, broken face. I let the cold, clinical authority of a self-made titan radiate through my gaze. I was the owner. I was the landlord. I was the venture capitalist. I held all the cards, and I was officially closing the table. "You told me failures don't belong at this table," I said, my voice cutting through the silence with smooth, deadly precision. "You were absolutely right. Elias, escort these people out. They can't afford the appetizers." Elias did not miss a single beat. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod toward the hallway. In less than 3 seconds, the heavy oak doors opened wide, and 4 members of my private security team stepped into the room. They were dressed in immaculate dark suits, moving with the kind of swift, coordinated precision that comes from protecting high-net-worth individuals. They did not shout, and they did not brandish weapons. Their sheer physical presence and absolute lack of hesitation were entirely sufficient. Carlton tried to resist. He planted his feet on the hardwood floor, puffing his chest out in a final, desperate attempt to assert his patriarchal dominance over men who were simply doing their jobs. He pointed a trembling finger at the lead security officer, threatening to sue the restaurant, threatening to call the chief of police, threatening to destroy my entire business license. The officer did not even blink. He simply stepped forward, wrapping a massive, unyielding hand firmly around Carlton's upper arm. The physical contact instantly shattered the illusion of my father's power. Carlton gasped, looking down at the hand holding him, and the fight drained out of him entirely. He was suddenly just an aging, bankrupt man being forcefully removed from a building he did not own. Connor did not require any physical coercion. The arrogant white son-in-law, who had strutted into my establishment demanding top-tier service, was completely broken. He shuffled toward the door like a hollow shell, staring blankly at the floorboards. He knew that the moment he stepped outside this restaurant, his life as a wealthy corporate executive was officially over. He was walking straight into a federal indictment, a divorce, and absolute public ruin. He did not look at me. He did not look at his wife. He just walked toward the exit, dragging his feet, dragging the weight of his own catastrophic hubris. Jasmine followed him, but not as a supportive spouse. She was screaming at the back of his head, her voice raw and hysterical. She ripped her diamond engagement ring off her finger and hurled it directly at Connor's back. It bounced off his ruined, tailored suit and clattered uselessly onto the floor. She called him a liar, a fraud, and a parasite, repeating the exact insults our father had used just minutes ago. The golden child was experiencing her first taste of real-world consequences, and she was handling it with all the grace of a spoiled toddler having a massive tantrum. She was escorted out by a female security guard, her cries echoing down the corridor. Vivian was the last to go. She remained on the floor, her designer dress wrinkled, her diamond necklace askew, her perfectly curated high society image completely decimated. 2 security officers reached down and gently but firmly lifted her by her elbows. She went entirely limp, forcing them to carry her weight. As they guided her toward the door, she turned her head back, looking at me over her shoulder. Her eyes were completely bloodshot, her face streaked with ruined makeup. She opened her mouth, trying to formulate one last manipulative plea, one last desperate guilt trip to drag me back into her toxic orbit. I did not give her the chance. I held her gaze with absolute icy indifference, refusing to offer her a single ounce of closure or comfort. I just watched her go. Elias stepped up beside the officers. "We will take them out through the service corridor," Elias stated, his voice perfectly calm and professional. The ultimate indignity for a family obsessed with status and public perception was being escorted out through the back exit, past the dumpsters and the delivery trucks. It was the exact same door Carlton had demanded I be thrown out of just an hour earlier. The heavy oak doors swung shut, pulling closed with a soft, solid click. Then there was silence. I stood in the center of the VIP dining room, entirely alone. The air in the room felt incredibly light, as if a heavy, suffocating fog had just been violently sucked out through the ventilation system. I looked down at the mahogany table. I looked at the shattered crystal goblet Jasmine had purposefully dropped. I looked at the puddle of sparkling water seeping into the floorboards. I looked at the glowing red screen of the point-of-sale terminal displaying Connor's declined credit card. And finally, I looked at the crisp black apron resting directly over my father's empty porcelain dinner plate. I stood there and absorbed the absolute golden silence. I closed my eyes and took a deep, clean breath, letting the reality of my complete victory wash over my skin. For 33 years, I had carried the ghost of a scared, inadequate little girl inside my chest. A little girl who constantly adjusted her personality to avoid triggering her father's rage. A little girl who swallowed her own ambitions because her mother told her they were not respectable enough. A young woman who stood shivering in the freezing rain, staring at a closed front door, believing that she was fundamentally broken, because the people who created her refused to love her. In that quiet room, looking at the wreckage they had left behind, I finally laid that ghost to rest. She was dead. She was gone. She had been replaced by a titan, a woman forged in the fires of their rejection. I realized with absolute, undeniable clarity that I never needed their permission to be great. Their disapproval was not a curse. It was the catalyst that propelled me to the top of the empire. I did not need to protect their legacy because I had built my own. I opened my eyes. The past was officially evicted. I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit. My bespoke trousers brushed softly against my legs and my heels clicked cleanly with a sharp, steady rhythm against the hardwood floor. I pushed open the doors of the private room and stepped out into the bustling main corridor of my restaurant. The contrast was immediate and entirely breathtaking. While the VIP room held the cold, sterile remains of a toxic family, the rest of the obsidian room was pulsing with vibrant, passionate energy. I walked past the host stand where patrons were eagerly waiting for their tables. I walked past the main dining area where laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of jazz music filled the air. This was the world I created. I pushed through the swinging double doors and stepped directly into the main kitchen. The heat hit me instantly, a comforting, familiar embrace of fire and spice. The kitchen was a symphony of perfectly orchestrated chaos. Sizzling pans, roaring flames, the sharp, rhythmic chopping of knives against cutting boards. Waitstaff moved gracefully through the line, picking up exquisite plates of food. The smell of braised short ribs, toasted garlic reduction sauces, and fresh herbs permeated every single corner of the massive stainless steel space. This was my real home. The moment I stepped onto the line, the energy shifted. My staff did not cower in fear. They did not avoid my gaze. They looked at me with genuine, profound respect. Chef Andre, my executive culinary director, looked up from plating a delicate seafood dish. He was a brilliant, fiercely talented man who shared my exact vision for elevating modern cuisine. He saw me standing there without my apron, wearing my tailored silk blouse. He took one look at my face, and he knew exactly what had just transpired. He did not ask any questions. He simply offered a sharp, respectful nod, acknowledging the victory of his leader. I nodded back, feeling a surge of fierce, protective love for the people in this room. This was my chosen family, a family built on mutual respect, shared passion, and absolute loyalty. We did not demand obedience through financial manipulation. We earned our place at the table through hard work and undeniable excellence. Elias walked through the swinging doors, stepping up beside me at the pass. The pass was the heartbeat of the kitchen, the long stainless steel counter where every single dish was inspected before it went out to the guests. Elias looked perfectly composed, not a single hair out of place. "The trash has been successfully removed from the premises," Elias stated, his voice low and smooth. "The security team ensured they left the property entirely. We also canceled their valet validation, so they had to pay full price for parking on their way out." A genuine bright laugh escaped my chest, echoing over the sound of the sizzling pans. It was the perfect petty cherry on top of a masterful execution. "Thank you, Elias," I said, turning to face him. "You handled that beautifully." "We protect our own," Elias replied, offering a small, knowing smile. "Is there anything else you require tonight?" I looked out over the glowing heat lamps of the pass, watching my culinary team operate at the absolute peak of their craft. I thought about the heavy metal credit card Connor had thrown onto the table. I thought about the arrogant demand he made just to humiliate me. Actually, Elias? I said, my voice steady and rich with satisfaction. Bring me the Chateau Hope Brian 2009, the bottle from the private reserve cellar. Elias's smile widened just a fraction. An excellent choice. He disappeared into the back corridors and returned less than 2 minutes later, holding the dark, elegant bottle of the $5,000 Bordeaux. He presented the label to me with the same flawless professional grace he would offer our most prestigious guests. I gave a nod of approval. He produced a sleek silver wine key and extracted the cork with one smooth, silent motion. He reached beneath the pass and retrieved a wide, bold crystal wine glass, polishing it quickly with a linen cloth before setting it on the stainless steel counter. He poured a perfect, generous measure of the dark ruby liquid. The rich, complex aroma immediately bloomed in the warm air of the kitchen. I picked up the crystal glass by the stem. I held it up to the harsh, bright lights of the kitchen pass, admiring the deep crimson color. I inhaled slowly, letting the scent of crushed rocks, black plum, and roasted espresso beans wash over my senses. It was exactly as I had described it to Connor. It was absolute perfection. I stood at the helm of my kitchen, surrounded by the roar of the flames and the dedication of my team. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. The vintage was incredibly full-bodied, dense, and velvety, finishing with remarkable length and purity. But beneath the complex tasting notes, it tasted like something else entirely. It tasted like vindication. It tasted like untouchable generational wealth. I looked through the glass partition, watching the crowded dining room full of people who paid thousands of dollars just to experience a fraction of the world I had built. I had started with nothing but a duffel bag and a rejection. I had turned their absolute worst insults into the foundation of a multi-million-dollar empire. I had evicted my abusers, foreclosed on my doubters, and reclaimed my entire narrative. I took another slow, luxurious sip of the $5,000 wine, allowing the warmth to settle deep into my chest. I smiled a real, radiant, unapologetic smile. This was what true power felt like: absolute, uncompromising freedom. The greatest lesson from this journey is that true success never requires the validation of toxic family members. When you stop shrinking yourself to fit into the narrow boxes built by people committed to misunderstanding you, you finally find the space to construct your own empire. Blood does not dictate loyalty or respect. Those are earned. By walking away from conditional love and financial manipulation, you reclaim your personal power. You do not have to protect a family legacy that actively diminishes your worth. Instead, focus on building a reality so undeniably brilliant and successful that they simply cannot ignore it. Share your own story in the comments below and subscribe for more satisfying tales of resilience and sweet revenge.